Thanks so much for joining us today for our second kind of episode of CCL's Big Tent Climate Talks. This is a new and engaging session that we are hosting monthly that spotlights diverse leaders in the climate community abroad. So at CCL, we know solving climate change requires a variety of policies and perspectives. This is why we do the work under a big tent. And that includes folks from the right, from the left, and every spot in between. In our Big Tent Climate Talk episodes, we'll talk to a wide variety of climate leaders outside of CCL to learn more about how we can all work together better. And I'm very excited to do that again today. So for starters, hi everyone. I'm Taylor Krause, CCL's National Partnerships and Coalitions Coordinator and a member of the Government Affairs team here in Washington, D.C. My title is a long one, but it essentially means that my job is to keep a pulse on what other organizations are doing and find ways that CCL can collaborate or work synergistically with. And I hope our session today gives you a little taste of how my conversations with other staff from other organizations go here in DC. For our episode today, we'll be hosting a conversation between myself and staff from the Audubon Society who work on Audubon's National Climate Initiative, Chloe Koseff and Tykee James. So before we get started, because of today's program is more of a back and forth conversation rather than like a one-way presentation, it might feel a little different than the typical talks we host on CCL Community. So I just want to make a few gentle reminders again. As CCLers, we love our focus and we are open-minded. So today's focus is on listening to and learning from the experiences of fellow climate advocates and other groups. If you bump into a moment or a reaction where someone shares something that you think or maybe feel differently about, really lean into that and see if this is an opportunity to learn about the larger climate movement and better understand a different perspective. In that vein, building support for a policy that we support, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, we know that this will require a really big and broad coalition. And so that means working on how to build a coalition. With that said, in learning from each other and working together, we can really get this job done of addressing climate change on a large scale. And so we'll be needing to listen to different voices in the climate movement and learn from each other. So with that said, I'll introduce today's guests, Chloe and Tykee. A bit about Chloe. Chloe works to advance climate mitigation solutions that are good for birds and people as Audubon's policy analyst. Since starting with Audubon in the summer of 2017, Chloe has worked across the climate program, including advising on bird-friendly sightings of renewable energy and advocating for federal energy and climate solutions policies. Prior to Audubon, she interned at the US Department of the Interior and conducted research on traditional agricultural systems on Hawaii's Big Island, which is so cool. Chloe has a master's of science in a degree in land and resource management and a bachelor of science degree in earth systems from Stanford University. I'm sure you've heard of it. I've also been fortunate to have been in the same fellowship class as Chloe for the Clean Energy Leadership Institutes, better known as CELI, which is an organization that aims to foster a diverse community of change makers across sectors and disciplines in order to drive an equitable, decarbonized, and resilient energy ecosystem, and is particularly focused toward young professionals in the energy and climate space. And a way that I got to know Chloe over about, I think it's like a 5-month-long program. It was a really long program. And so Chloe, is there anything that I might be missing that you'd like folks on the call to possibly know about you that I might have missed? No? Okay, great. A bit about Tykee. So Tykee has been a part of the birding community for almost an entire decade. He moved to DC and joined the National Audubon Society in December of 2018. His background is highlighted with experience as an environmental educator, community organizer, and environmental policy advisor in his hometown of Philly. Most recently, he was a moderator for Birding While Black conversation during Birders Blackbirders Week, which is going on this week, I believe. So thanks so much for making time to have this conversation. And Tykee, is there anything else that you'd like folks to know about you that I might have missed? I'm also aware that you've encountered our volunteers and have worked with them. I remember seeing you at the Mid-Atlantic Conference last year when the world was open again. And maybe if you want to tell the audience a little bit more about that.
Well, two things. One, Blackbirders Week is not happening this
Oh,
week. You're
sorry.
thinking of Taking Nature Black. Uh, Black events may look similar, but they are indeed different. And I spoke at the Mid Atlantic Conference now 2 years ago, in 2019, because last summer was broken ankle summer for me. um, and that was a really great conference because I got to see how so many folks can have a role in the climate movement.
Well, I am sorry about confusing the two, and would love to jump into our first questions to kick off the Big Tent Climate Talk today. And so I was wondering if either one of you wanted to talk about your favorite bird and maybe why, and maybe some fun facts that you might have about that bird.
I think I remember Chloe telling me what her favorite bird is.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. I'm newer to the birding community than Tykee. I actually really got into birds after I started at Audubon, but have learned a lot since, and we've been birding together a bunch. Tykee and I, and me, and many chapters of Audubon across the country. I would say my favorite is the scarlet tanager. It's a migratory bird, and it's really beautiful. The male is this beautiful bright red color, and the female is this beautiful yellow color. And I like it because I'm trying to be better at telling the differences between male and female birds. And that one's one where it's really obvious, and both are very beautiful. So awesome bird. And you can see it here in DC in the spring and the fall.
And actually, the scarlet tanager is a bird that I kind of have a shirt that makes me think that I'm a scarlet tanager. I wear that from time to time. That's a great bird. One of my favorite birds is the belted kingfisher. It got me started into birding, and it connected me to my community in a way that made me rely on the history of what's happened there to answer the question, why aren't more folks enjoying the birds like me? And the belted kingfisher was a really good bird to get that started. And actually, a friend of mine made a kingfisher stitch for me because I'm such a big fan. This is a common kingfisher, but yeah, kingfisher regardless, great bird, great tattoo idea. Just FYI.
Is that you slyly telling us that you have a tattoo of said bird?
Oh man, I am not that cool. I am not at all that cool.
Okay, well, maybe I should add that to the next show of people sharing their favorite tattoo, just in case. I
Oh
think
man,
that
there is a growing community of bird tattoo people with bird tattoos. I don't know the proper name for them, but they're clearly in another league of cool.
great. Well, I think that maybe I should start off with my more formal question that I have for this show then, and then I'll see if I could ever lean into the tattoo question. But I'd love to hear how both of you, just like as individuals, got into the climate movement. I know it's especially important to grassroots organizing around climate change and advocating to your elected representatives about telling your climate story. And that's something that we try to have for our volunteers, but I think it's always inspirational to hear other people's personal stories working on climate and how they came to it.
My start wasn't necessarily about climate as much as it was about justice, right? Because as you mentioned, I worked as an environmental policy advisor for a state representative in North Philly. That was my introduction into environmental advocacy at large. And I understood that the environmental advocacy field was mostly white. And most of the issues that they would talk about would just be climate. Climate, this thing, this science, this understanding that doesn't speak to or hasn't connected with the people who are being affected by it. And it wasn't until a little bit of my own research, but also like learning about efforts that organizations are taking to be intersectional in their policy perspectives, did I realize that really the climate movement has been part of the environmental justice movement for a long time. because the emissions that provide toxins to lungs, Philadelphia is one of the, or at least where I lived in Philadelphia, it had a zip code that was one of the highest rates of asthma. And I was born having asthma, lived around the country not having asthma, came back to Philly with asthma. Knowing that that zip code has a high asthma rate from an emitter that's just across the river, I think is from the Schuylkill. Philadelphia Energy Solutions actually exploded 2 summers ago, so it doesn't exist anymore. But when it did, and I think the effects in the air are still there, those effects in the lungs also affect the warming of the planet. But without that connection being made, my introduction into climate was mostly seeing it as the white environmentalist issue and not necessarily the issue of the people.
Great. Thank you so much, Tykee. Chloe, do you want to go next?
Sure. So my story, I grew up in the Bay Area in California and was really lucky and privileged to be surrounded by a lot of just beautiful landscapes. And I do think the Bay Area is one of the most beautiful places in the whole world. So shout out to Northern California. But when I was a teenager and kind of on from there, going through college, the state was hit with just devastating droughts, and it just kind of impacted every decision that we made. When you could do anything kind of depended on when your water days were. It was a constant topic of conversation. When is the rain coming? When are the fires coming? And my first summer out of college, I worked at a camp that a fire tore through at the end of the summer. And luckily there was minimal damage because we prepare for fires in California. But it's just that kind of nexus of water and drought and fire has been something that, since I was a teenager, has really shaped the way that I view the environment. And kind of, I hate, I can't even see the tap running a second longer than it has to. It permeates into that every little thing that I do. And so kind of that fascination with drought and water and energy brought me into the climate space, especially after the Rim Fire in California in 2013. And so ever since have been kind of working on solutions to climate change.
Great, thank you so much for that. I'm from San Diego originally, and I remember fire days, and just remember the sky being orange, not being able to go outside for a week at a time. So I definitely relate to the whole California fire days. My next question also to lead this discussion is hearing more about the work that Audubon is doing as your role as staff there. So are there particular projects or area of focus that your organization broadly works on and that you're working on and that you'd love for our volunteers to hear about?
Yeah, so I could start it off, and Tykee, you can add in anything that I miss. So we are an over 100-year-old conservation organization really dedicated to protecting birds in the places they need. And up until the last decade, that's really been focused on kind of what we think of as more of these kind of non-climate issues. So thinking about coastal conservation, working lands, watersheds, protecting watersheds and clean water. And in 2014, Audubon put out a birds and climate change report that showed that climate change is the biggest threat to North American birds. And in 2019, we put out an update to that report that showed that that is still true, and that if we actually work to reduce our emissions from that business as usual scenario, we have the ability to actually improve the outcome for 75% of imperiled species. So it really did show the difference between kind of letting things happen and business as usual. And so that's really been kind of the intellectual framework for our climate strategy that started in 2014. And so in the history of an over 100-year-old organization is pretty short. And so in that, we kind of focus on a couple, I would say 5 main tenets, one being just adaptation. And that's a lot of kind of thinking about how we protect our coasts, our watersheds, our working lands from what we recognize are the symptoms of climate change now. And then the other 4 kind of working to address the actual causes and mitigate climate change. So 100% clean electricity, market-based solutions, energy innovation, and natural climate solutions. So that's kind of the broad scope of it. Tykee, anything I missed on that?
No, you hit that right on the head there.
Yeah, so it's a real mix for us. I mean, we're thinking about really those energy technical solutions, but also thinking about the kind of ways that we can leverage nature to both help mitigate climate change and also help adapt. The world is changing and we have to adapt. And so how we do that to protect the bird species we love, and also the people that use these landscapes and are going to be impacted by worsening weather, by bad air quality, by everything, because without the world is going to change, and without thinking about the adaptation side, we're really missing a big piece of the puzzle too.
Great. Well, that's a pretty comprehensive overview of what Audubon does. I don't know if either one of you have like a current project that you're working on right now, or initiative that you're excited about and would love to share.
Sure, I can start, and then Tykee. Great. So what I've really been digging into lately is actually natural climate solutions. And so this is something that is a newer kind of strategy for Audubon, even though we've been doing this work indirectly for a number of years. And so it's about thinking about ways that we can manage our landscapes, like forests, like grasslands, like agricultural lands, wetlands, to actually one, sequester additional carbon, or two, reduce the amount of carbon that is emitted from them from the way that we utilize them. And so, one thing I will say about this is, like, this is not going to be the solution to climate change. Like, we still have to hit net zero emissions from our, electricity, our manufacturing, everything. But this is one way that we can help kind of reach that net zero, in addition to the work that we're doing, in the kind of man-made spaces of like the electric grid and manufacturing and everything like that. So, and this is a really great niche for us because it's also a way to protect habitat and protect these these spaces that birds are going to need more and more as their ranges shift and it gets harder to survive. And so I'm working on a number of forestry and grassland related bills that are going to hopefully be really bipartisan in nature and be a way to kind of get drive down emissions and also invest in rural communities that haven't always been a part of the climate solution, but should be, because they have so much power to do so.
One thing that I typically work on in my job description as a government affairs coordinator is organizing bird walks with members of Congress and congressional staff, something I haven't been able to do for a while because I broke my ankle in last January, but also coronavirus. I hear that often stops gatherings of people. But prior to that, and without the idea of what we can't do right now, bird watching was always a way for me to build community and build coalition. And the National Audubon Society is taking exactly what Chloe is saying and putting it on a bird or putting a bird on it because birders vote. Birders are very strong advocates, not just for the birds and the places they need, but with the addition of good policy, that good legislation can help birds and people, in a way that doesn't leave folks behind. When we're talking about energy transition and who that may leave behind, when we're talking about where environmental benefits go, we're not having accumulated impacts as a second thought. I think that we have a role in shaping some of these policies that are bipartisan, that do make sense, but shaping them still in a way that achieve an equitable outcome.
Great. Thank you for that. And I also am realizing that I forgot to share my favorite bird. I did promise Chloe that I was going to do this, which is the solitary sandpiper, which is one of the birds that I grew up seeing in San Diego. And they're really cute, guys. If you can just look at them. I know that they are actually on a rare bird alert in San Diego that I just found out in terms of my research. So thank you, Chloe, for pushing me to share my favorite bird, and give some food for thought of ways that like I can participate in trying to conserve my favorite bird in my hometown. And in terms of these different policies that that Chloe and Tykee have highlighted for Citizens Climate Lobby, I know that we are all known as the carbon pricing people, but I think that as we see this new frontier in an administration, that climate ambition is really opening up. I think for our volunteers, we are trying to keep an open mind to different policies that we can be helpful in. So that's great to hear that Audubon seems to also be valuing bipartisanship. And I think as serious climate advocates and young people too, wanting to see policies that last the test of administrative turnover, which historically we are aware of happens. And so we don't want to see partisan politics playing into a topic or an area that we care so much about, and will need durable policies in order to stand that test of time. So something that in terms of conversations that I have with partners when this is just one-on-one, not usually in front of an audience, I like to offer, if there are certain bills or policies that you think CCL can help in terms of grassroots like work, please let me know, and I can see if that's something that's in line with like our bandwidth and what our staff can help provide resources for all of our volunteers to go into lobby meetings or bring in front of their members of Congress. And so happy to offer that too. I do want to also say that today we're going to wrap up relatively quickly. So I'm going to get through as many questions as I can, but we're going to stop around 3:40 today. So if you do have questions, we are going to try to do a Q&A, but I'm going to get through a couple more first. So with that said, the next question are, what are your guys' thoughts or in terms of how we can best be in the movement together? I think that coalition work is something that's important for trying to get climate policies across the finish line. And if there are particular ways that you see CCL being helpful, I'd love to hear your guidance and thoughts on that.
Do you want to take this one first, or I can go first? Go for it? Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think that something that's really special about both CCL and Audubon is that we're both chapter-based organizations, which means that we actually have really excited people on the ground getting into, offices of their elected officials and talking about what matters. And that's something that not every climate and environmental organization has, this like real grassroots power across the country. And so I think that, we both play a really important role of kind of actually getting into those offices and showing that constituents are educated on these issues, really care about them, are talking to their community about it, and, really want to see their elected officials, kind of no matter where they are on the spectrum of climate champion to not really taking this seriously. And so, I think that is something that, we at Audubon are trying to even do better every day, is really harnessing the power of our grassroots that are really fired up about these issues and channeling that into actual like contact and work and relationships with elected officials. And I think that's something that CCL does really well. I mean, I've been to your conference in DC and seen the enthusiasm in the room. And so, I think that is something that we can continue to do, is like find these areas of overlap and really be the boots on the ground in the offices in district and in DC, and really showing that there is real constituent desire to take these issues seriously.
I think my same bag of tricks is just, let's go on a bird walk. Let's talk about what we are trying to conserve. Let's be in the places that are important for people and wildlife. It doesn't just have to be birds. Birds are indeed a great indicator of habitat, but what birds eat also indicate habitat, and the lack of food for birds means lack of birds, just in the plain sense. And I think it's important that we also share truths about where we have been in this movement, this 100 and so year old organization, making, as you mentioned, Chloe, a 10-year ago pivot towards climate. I don't think that's incidental with or I don't think that we should ignore that also the threats of climate change have been a lot more present in the last 10 years than maybe they've been in the last 20. And seeing the amount of support for that has taken so many forms. Like I mentioned earlier, we just have a bird indicator on ours, and being decentralized in the idea of how we operate in our chapters to be local where we can be. I think that's always great. But yeah, we have to bird together, and I think share some really deep truths about where we have been in this movement.
Great. Thank you for that. It sounds like really bringing the issues that climate change affects, whether it's birds, other local impacts in your actual communities, to your elected representatives and making those very real is something that's really important to you both, and to Audubon more broadly. And I think for our volunteers, that's something that I really appreciate, just making Congress more accessible. I know for a fact that before I even heard of CCL and started learning about CCL, I didn't know how to get in touch with my member of Congress. I didn't even know who my member of Congress was. I'm really sorry, volunteers, that I'm admitting that to you guys right now. But that's what it's all about. So in terms of, I'd love to hear what's, for reading purposes, maybe what's at the top of your guys' stack. What have you been reading as of late that you might recommend to other people?
It's funny that you ask.
Yeah, right here.
Right? If we are going to need a sustainable movement, we're going to need more organizers. And I, strongly endorse and recommend no better way to become an organizer in your own community, in your own organization, than the Midwest Academy for Social Change. I'll give that book a second look for folks that are interested. And as you can see, this book is used heavily because we got to organize.
Awesome. That's a great recommendation. I know a lot of our staff have gone through that training and love it. There's kind of two piles of things that I've really been reading a lot lately. One is a lot of scientific papers about kind of our forests and our grasslands, and how we always aim to be a science-based organization. So I'm doing a lot of reading of scientific papers that are actually examining how our forests and our grasslands can be sinks, and what kind of changes in climate are actually going to do to that. So that's very dense, but it's interesting, and it's all going to inform kind of the way that we're actually engaging on it and making sure that we're only pushing policies that are really grounded in science. And the other is a lot of reading about just how the environmental movement has been really grounded in whiteness over the last 100, 200, however long it is. And a lot of the ways that, our own organization, our namesake is somebody, John James Audubon, who doesn't, who was a slaveholder, and he's someone that we have held on a pedestal, but is someone whose history deserves to be re-examined. And that's an article that our magazine put out this month. And so, there's work that we're doing internally at Audubon to re-examine that, but there's a lot of examples across the environmental and climate movement of ways that we have neglected to center the people that are most impacted by kind of the problems that have arisen. And so kind of trying to absorb a lot more of that and help that inform the way that I am working in our advocacy, and helping kind of set our priorities internally at Audubon.
Right. And Chloe, you made me think about this book too, a book that gets you started on, Chloe, I think, has hit level 5 in it, but this can really get you started on how the environmental movement, especially the one that dealt with land conservation and wildlife conservation, where it's starting from, because it is quite a history, and it is very Eurocentric in a way that, is pro-colonization and anti First Peoples, First Nations peoples, and anti-Black and misogynistic and homophobic. There's a lot of things that this movement started on that have to be part of the truth that we tell today when we understand who has been leading this and who's been left behind.
Great. I love these book recommendations. And for everyone that wants to have these available to them after this call is going to be recorded and everybody can access them. If you're having trouble trying to find these, please feel free to email me. I'm going to put my contact information at the end and we'll try to get those to you as soon as possible. And in the vein of talking about how the environmental movement has been a very heavily white dominated movement, and in terms of like a lens forward, I'd love to hear more about the work that Audubon is doing in environmental justice right now, and maybe some policies that you're looking at or some initiatives that you're looking at that you think grassroots movements or CCL could be more involved in.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to start and acknowledge that we're just not far enough along on this journey. This is something that we started taking seriously within the last year, or not seriously, but really centering in the last year. And so we have a lot of work to do as an organization to really understand how we're incorporating this into all of the policy that we are advocating for. And I think, we really do deeply care about bipartisanship, and I think are people that can work with both sides of the aisle. And so how do we use that voice and that ability to work with both sides to make sure that these ideas are actually being worked into bipartisan legislation as well. We have done some work with a lot of Indigenous communities on some land management, and are working with Indigenous communities in the boreal forest to do some kind of some bird monitoring. But I think, it's been very case by case. It's been a lot of work driven by our state offices, and it's not something that we're doing well enough at the national level. So that's something that we're really working on internally. And I hope 6 months from now, I'll have more to report out on that.
And yeah, to Chloe's answer, when you ask, what are you doing? What is the you? Chloe and I, we work on the national level. I work in federal engagement. She works in climate policy. Two places that have, a prominent role in help shaping this, but we are by no means the only folks who are working on this and finding a way for it to be integrated as a core principle in achieving outcomes that are good for that are good for birds and people, and not having it as a afterthought takes institutional and cultural change. And being in the reckoning of it as my first professional job has been rewarding for sure. I've definitely learned a lot, but it's hard not to be a little frustrated when an organization of this size, of this age, is coming to terms almost as like an option. Like it just came as an option for us to start seeing this, where on local levels, there have been accomplishments. On local levels, on community levels, there have been great alliances and great, accomplishments. But figuring out how to integrate that so that, again, it's part of the core outcomes that we're looking for and not an afterthought is going to take a very transformative shift.
Yeah, I think that this is a big opportunity, especially for people within environmental organizations that maybe look more institutional, to really take a deep look at how to drive a more equitable, diverse community within the climate advocacy movement that I think you've highlighted very well the pitfalls of, and it needs reevaluating. So I know, Chloe, that's great to hear that you also are hoping to be able to report out something a lot more useful in 6 months. And I echo the same sentiments for Citizens Climate Lobby. Yeah, so that's great to hear. And in terms of a couple more questions, I have a bunch coming in from the audience. So I want to get a couple before we have to stop in 5 minutes. And so you mentioned that Audubon is favoring market-based solutions to climate change. Is there any specific legislation that Audubon endorses right now that employs a market-based strategy or reducing greenhouse gases? And would you like to talk about those kinds of policies, Chloe?
Yeah, so I think, we see carbon pricing as a piece of the puzzle. And so, it needs to be an ambitious price on carbon that actually has the ability to drive down emissions across the economy. As far as where the revenue from that goes, we haven't nailed down exactly what our preferred policy design is for that. But we have been supportive of a lot of the bipartisan efforts to introduce carbon pricing legislation and get members of both parties on the record saying that this is a tool in the toolbox. I would say that, as an organization, we've been more focused on some of the other pieces that we think have to go along with that, of getting to 100% clean electricity, of driving innovation, of like everything else. But I think at the end of the day, we do see carbon pricing or a clean energy standard or something along those lines being a part of this kind of holistic getting the entire economy to net zero by 2050 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and keep warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Great. Thank you for that, Chloe. And just for the audience, I think that these are really big, tough questions that they're answering so well. And I do have one fun question. That would be for Tykee that I was asked is, do you have a favorite or memorable story from taking an elected official bird watching?
Well, the short story is I've never taken an elected official on a bird walk because I'm not a constituent. We like to have their constituents do it. We want their voters to do it. I've been doing it on Capitol Hill monthly during 2019. And during those monthly bird walks, there was one staffer from a congressman's office in New York who pledged, who announced that she was a birder from coming to subsequent bird walks. And someone who was on the Energy and Commerce Committee, never birded before in his life, never picked up a pair of binoculars before. And I would point out one bird, the house sparrow, and describe its principles of identification. We would see, a mockingbird come up, and then all of a sudden he would just be like, okay, cool, what's that bird? And then it would be a blue jay. Okay, what's that bird? That's a cardinal. Okay, what's that bird? That's a ring-winged blackbird. Like this, he was just so quick with getting it, and it really reminded me, it ignited me on why I love birding with first timers and why it is so much fun to share that love and to share that experience, which is very different than, just having a meeting.
Yeah, and so for closing then, is there a way that our volunteers can potentially look up ways to bring their member of Congress on a bird walk, or maybe even ways that you suggest that they can look at the local impacts of birds in their communities?
So two things on my end, and then I let Tykee speak to the bird walks. So as far as the science, we have a website, I think it's climate.audubon.org, and it has maps for every single species showing how their ranges will shift at 1.5, 2, and 3 degrees Celsius. And also gets down to the zip code level. So if you are interested in kind of like what the changes that you are going to see in your zip code are, as far as birds that are going to be there and birds that are not, you can check that out. It's a really cool tool, and it's something that we've actually brought to a lot of members of Congress to kind of show like what the actual changes in their backyard are going to look like. And it's really impactful. Like, you would be surprised how many members of Congress are bird lovers, have some relationship to birds, and are like astounded to see that maybe something that they really care about isn't going to be there anymore. So we found that it's a really just great way to connect with people. And if you are a bird lover yourself, you might be interested to see the changes in your own backyard. And the other thing I'll say is that we're running a number of state level campaigns in states across the country. You may be, some states that we don't think of as being climate leaders, like Indiana, for instance. We are working, in the state and trying to build support for climate solutions there. So that is another way to get plugged into some of the kind of more local work that we're doing, because we are actually really trying to get engaged like on the state level in places like that you wouldn't traditionally think of, Arkansas being another one. And so we have dedicated staff that are running those campaigns. They are, more state level, but it's another way to just make that local impact and get plugged in with lawmakers that you may not have thought about, because we think of politics as being so national. So those are two resources that that I can share, and that I know that CCL volunteers, being as enthusiastic as they are, would really enjoy and maybe like to get plugged in with.
Great, thank you, Chloe. And I see that Brett threw those resources in the chat. So thank you, Brett. Again, please feel free to reach out to me if anyone that views this recording or is on right now that isn't able to capture this, to please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll try to get those to you as soon as possible. In terms of bird walks, Tykee, do you want to run us through, and then I'm going to have to wrap up this delightful conversation.
Yes, to be brief, check out Audubon.org, because there's probably a chapter near you that's thinking the same thing, but they don't have all the things that they need to know about climate yet. Or they want to find ways to work with more climate advocates and not just environmental naturalists. So you could be very much a part of the puzzle that, carbon pricing is on the federal level when it comes down to legislation.
Yeah, and I know most local chapters are working at the local level too. For instance, Tykee is on the DC Audubon board, and there's an advocacy committee that's part of that, that's working on DC based policy. I think people forget here in DC we have a local government as well, and so that's a way to get plugged into people that are organized around some of the issues that are actually important to, like, the city or the county or the area where you live.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Well, with that said, Brett, did you want to transition us out?
I just wanted to thank everyone for being here today. We are going to put a link in the chat where you can find the recording that's going to drop right after this. Check that out, as well as feedback. Please reach out and let us know what we can do better, who else we can talk to next time. And I think I'm just echoing all of the plus ones we're getting here in the chat for both of your times, Tykee and Chloe. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your wisdom, for your organizing, for your hard work, for the climate, for the birds, and for all of our futures. It's an honor to get to know you and work together.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
This has been great.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time and all your candor and great responses. And if there's anything that CCL or myself can do, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you everyone for coming today. And we'll see you guys next time for the fourth Thursday of the month at 3 p.m. for the next Big Tent Talk.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.